Delayed for a second. All right. So looking at the cardiovascular system today, objectives that we want to understand what constitutes the cardiovascular system. So that's going to be your heart, your blood, and your blood vessels. Spoiler alert, I know I'm in the intro right now, but then we want to understand like the functions of our cardiovascular system and what it does, the purpose behind it, how it is, and then we're going to talk about a very, very cool scientific process called electrical excitation. And that is basically how electricity runs through your heart. So like, every time your heart beats, right, it has like a little electrochemical signal that kind of goes off in it, right? And that's what we're going to see. We're going to see how our heart actually makes that electrochemical signal. And that's called excitation. That'll be a really fun thing to talk about. We'll talk about how cardiac output is very, very important as well. Cardiac output being the overall performance of our heart and how we measure that as trainers. Maximal oxygen uptake, how the right amount of oxygen which has been extracted by our respiratory system is actually going to keep our heart alive. Talk about Vo2 Max. That's going to be a really big concept. Your Vo2 Max is basically the volume of oxygen consumed at maximum. Now, that kind of sounds like a respiratory system thing, but remember, like we talked about yesterday, right? There's a difference between ventilation and respiration, right? Ventilation is getting the gas in. Respiration is actually using it. And so if you are using up all the oxygen, very, very quickly, then your heart rate is going to go very, very high. So we're going to talk about how like your heart rate and your Vo2 max, your volume of oxygen consumed at maximum, are very, very linked. Vo2 max is one of my favorite topics just because it's a really great way to directly measure how cardiovascularly fit somebody is. And there's all kinds of like, VO2 testing protocols out there. So we'll watch a little bit of one. So we can kind of understand a little bit about that today. And then we want to talk a little bit about the anatomy too. We got to understand the different chambers of the heart. We got to talk about like systole and diastole and how blood pressure works. Not that you guys are going to necessarily have to like do a lot of direct blood pressure testing using the hardest medical equipment word to say. Not that you guys are going to have to use a traditional sphygmomanometer. That is my favorite term in the medical world, just because that word is ridiculous. Sphygmomanometer, but that's a blood pressure cuff. I don't know why they have to call it that, but it's a blood pressure cuff. And so you're not going to necessarily have to use like the traditional version of that. Most of the time, nowadays everybody just uses electric. We give you the manual one in your bags to this day, which is crazy to me because I think the manual ones are like $20 and it's like the electric ones are like $30. I keep trying to tell them, I'm like, do this, but our director of learning is she's old school. Jessica is she really likes like the old school approach of like a manual inflation. But anyway, that's where we're headed today. It's fun. I'm a big cardio guy, so I love talking about the cardiovascular system. So in general, we'll go ahead and break this down and then we'll get into our first video today. I think we got 2 of them to watch today, just like last time. So the cardiovascular system, this is going to be comprised of your heart, your blood, and your blood vessels. So that's the system as a whole, right? You could argue that the circulatory system is the blood vessels part, and then like the heart is its own sort of thing, but like put them all together, cardiovascular system. So when we're talking about the cardiorespiratory system, we're talking about how your heart and lungs are working together. This is responsible for providing a delivery system of nutrients throughout the body. And its main purpose in this world is to generate and maintain pressure. So we talked about pressure yesterday, right? We talked about how like we have both concentration gradients and we have pressure gradients. And either way, the universe hates a gradient, like gradients are just like nails on a chalkboard. And so if there's a lot of stuff over here and very little stuff over here, stuff wants to naturally move this way, until the amount of pressure is equal on both sides, right? That's why you ever see, like in sci-fi movies and stuff, like the reason people get sucked out into space, like it's like, don't open that door, blah! And everybody goes like flying out the spaceship door or whatever. The reason stuff like that happens is because like there's a bunch of nothing in space, and there's like a bunch of something in the spaceship. So when you expose the nothingness of space to the somethingness of inside the spaceship, all of the somethingness wants to evenly disperse itself across the universe. And so it moves from an area where there's high pressure out the door to an area where there's low pressure. That's how your heart is going to do things. Your heart, if you think about like your cardiovascular system, it's an entirely closed circuit. This is a really important concept, actually. Like we have a closed vascular system. Most mammals do. And what I mean when I say closed vascular system is I mean like every tube eventually connects. There's no point in which like the tubes are open. Like you think about like a sewer, right? Like the sewer has like all the pipes are connected, but eventually like they end in like a thing that just kind of spits all the water out into like probably like a big tank, like a big reservoir, right? Like something sewer reservoir, I don't know how to spell reservoir apparently, reservoir. But yeah, it always ends in like, there's an empty hole at the end, right? Your body doesn't do that. Your body is all connected. Every tube, there's no open holes, right? This is actually why, and I hate to do this. I'm sorry, but I got to ruin Spider-Man. But this is why Spider-Man could never really exist. At least in the way, like if you ever measure how fast Spider-Man like swings when he's like on, like, you look at the movies and stuff, he goes down and it gets down at the bottom and then he swings back up. That would never, spiders can actually do that. Actual spiders can do that. And the reason they can do that is because they have an open vascular system. Their tubes actually their heart just kind of sits in the center of their body. And when it beats, it kind of just splashes blood everywhere, kind of evenly distributing, which is good if you're a simple little insect, or arachnid. But like, that is not true of like us. If we had something like that, we wouldn't be able to like get oxygen where we need to go. And it would keep us from passing out on roller coasters and things like that. But with a closed vascular system, what happens, unfortunately, and you guys have probably seen this, people on roller coasters sometimes, or like, you always see it in like fighter jet pilots, like when they go really, really fast and then they eventually like pass out, or like astronauts, right? The reason that happens is because basically blood is in these closed tubes and it gets pulled to one section and it can't continue traveling through the tubes. So then all of a sudden your brain doesn't get any oxygen and your brain goes, okay, well, without oxygen, we're going to shut down for a minute, and turns everything off. So that's sort of the disadvantage of a closed vascular system. We can't swing like Spider-Man. I guess the Tobey Maguire Spider-Mans would make a little bit of sense because like he could like shoot it out of his arms and stuff. So like arguably it changed his whole physiology. But like Spider-Man's my favorite superhero, so love using that as my example. So that's what our closed vascular system actually is, right? It's this series of closed tubes all interconnected. So our job is to generate pressure in order to move blood throughout that entire system, right? So like if you had a tube over here and you had another tube over here and we contract this section, now there's a whole bunch of pressure on this side and there's very little pressure over here. So blood is naturally going to travel that way. And that's what your cardiovascular system does. Your heart is going to generate pressure by squeezing and contracting, right? And now there's a bunch of pressure. So blood leaves the heart, goes through all the various tubes of the body to wherever it needs to go. And that's how your blood vessels also change shape and size in order to be able to regulate pressure as well. So when we look at the role, that's why we say it is responsible. It's a delivery system of nutrients, and it's responsible by generating pressure and maintaining that pressure. which is why high blood pressure is such a bad disease. You know, when your blood pressure is outside of normal ranges all the time, not only is like it making it difficult for you to move nutrients around the body effectively, but also you got to think about like when blood actually does kind of leave that system and go into a tissue and then come back, like in your kidneys, for instance. Now there's so much pressure, it's like a pressure washer inside your kidneys. You're blasting the walls of those darn things, and that's dangerous. You know, like that's creating damage, which is why kidney damage is associated with hypertension or high blood pressure. So that is the role of our cardiovascular system. It's all their jobs. It helps us regulate our body temperature. You know, if you're very I don't know if anybody in here's ever, like, if you've ever been really, really, really hot and if you've ever tried this, but if you go over to like your sink and you run your wrists under like a cold tap, you know, just run that under some tap water. It's a really good way to cool down because it will actually carry it, that cool temperature throughout the rest of your body, and your body temperature will reduce down back to a normal level. So regulating body temperature is part of our cardiovascular system. It also removes heat through like sweat, and it also monitors your pH. So like, for instance, if your blood notices that it is really hot, if your body notices that it's very hot, what it'll do is it'll move your blood close to the surface of your skin, and then you're going to start sweating, and when that happens, now there's all this water sitting on the outside of your skin there. Blood is really close by, cool air goes rushing over, evaporates out of that water, carries all that heat away with it. And that's why like sweat, you know, that's why a cool breeze running across water kind of cools you down. And then because the blood is right at the surface of the skin, it's able to grab some of that cold temperature and carry it around to wherever it's going. The exact opposite is true as well. If you're very cold, your blood will move away from the surface of your skin. All your blood vessels will actually constrict, and that way it gets further away from the skin. And that way it can maintain the temperature that it does have so that you don't get any colder. And obviously, and probably most importantly, your cardiovascular system's job is to distribute oxygen and nutrients throughout the body. So we got a lot going on today. So let's go ahead and check out our first crash course of video today. I want to make sure I get the right ones. Blood vessels. Yeah, I got this right. Okay. Under pressure.
Your heart.
Oh, I need to make sure I share the sound. All right, here we go.
Your heart, that throbbing, beating muscle, is probably the most iconic organ in your body. No other organ gets its own holiday or as much radio play, and you're unlikely to get a love note decorated with a kidney or a spleen or even a brain, which is really what rules the emotions. Don't get me wrong, the heart does some great things. Namely, it powers the entire circulatory system, transporting nutrients, oxygen, waste, heat, hormones, and immune cells throughout the body over and over. But in the end, the heart does not make you love, it doesn't break apart if you get dumped by your boo, and it's not a lonely hunter. The truth is, the heart is really just a pump. A big, wet, muscly brute of a pump. And it doesn't care about poetry or chocolate or why you're crying. The heart has only one concern: maintaining pressure. If you've ever squeezed the trigger on a squirt gun or opened a can of shaken soda, you've seen how fluids flow from areas of high pressure, like inside the gun or the can, to areas of low pressure, like outside. The heart's entire purpose is to maintain that same kind of pressure gradient by generating high hydrostatic pressure to pump blood out of the heart while also creating low pressure to bring it back in. That gradient of force is what we mean when we talk about blood pressure. It's basically a measure of the amount of strain your arteries feel as your heart moves your blood around. More than 5 liters of it at about 60 beats per minute. That's about 100,000 beats a day, 35 million a year, 2 to 3 billion heartbeats in a lifetime. The basic physiology of which you can easily feel just by taking your own pulse. I don't have a watch. Now that might not inspire so much poetry, but it turns out it's still a pretty good story. Let us begin with a little anatomy. Unless you happen to be of the Grinch persuasion, the average adult human heart is about the size of two fists clasped together. One of the few bits of trivia you often hear about human anatomy that is actually true. The heart is hollow, vaguely cone-shaped, and weighs only about 250 to 350 grams, a pretty modest size for your body's greatest workhorse. And although Americans tend to put their right hand over their left breast while pledging allegiance, the heart is actually situated pretty much in the center of your chest, snuggled in the mediastinum cavity between your lungs. It sits at an angle, though, with one end pointing inferiorly toward the left hip and the other toward the right shoulder, so most of its mass rests just a little bit left of the mid-sternal line. The heart is nestled in a double-walled sac called the pericardium. The tough outer layer, or fibrous pericardium, is made of dense connective tissue and helps protect the heart while anchoring it to some of the surrounding structures, so it doesn't bounce all over the place while it's beating. Meanwhile, the inner serous pericardium consists of an inner visceral layer, or epicardium, which is actually part of the heart wall, and an outer parietal layer. These two layers are separated by a thick film of fluid that acts like a natural lubricant, providing a slippery environment for the heart to move around in so it doesn't create friction as it beats. The wall of the heart itself is made of yet more layers, 3 of them. That epicardium on the outside, the myocardium in the middle, which is mainly composed of cardiac muscle tissue that does all the work of contracting, and the innermost endocardium, a thin white layer of squamous epithelial tissue. Deeper inside, the heart has a whole lot of moving pieces that I'm not going to pick apart here, because the really big thing to understand is how the general system of chambers and valves and veins and arteries all work together to circulate blood around your body. Of course, fluid likes to move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure, and the heart creates those pressures. Form, once again following function. Your heart is divided laterally into 2 sides by a thin inner partition called the septum. This division creates 4 chambers, 2 superior atria, which are the low pressure areas, and 2 inferior ventricles that produce the high pressures. Each chamber has a corresponding valve, which acts like a bouncer at a club at closing time, like he'll let you out, but not back in. When a valve opens, blood flows in one direction into the next chamber, and when it closes, that's it. No blood can just flow back into the chamber it just left. So if you put your ear against someone's chest, and yeah, ask for permission first, you'll hear that lub-dub. Lub-dub. What you're really hearing are the person's heart valves opening and closing. It's a relatively simple but quite elegant setup, really. Functionally, those atria are the receiving chambers for the blood coming back to the heart after circulating through the body. The ventricles, meanwhile, are the discharging chambers that push the blood back out of the heart. As a result, the atria are pretty thin-walled because the blood flows back into the heart under low pressure, and all those atria have to do is push it down into the relaxed ventricles, which doesn't take a whole lot of effort. The ventricles are beastly by comparison. They're the true pumps of the heart, and they need big, strong walls to shoot blood back out of the heart with every contraction. And the whole thing is connected to the rest of your circulatory system by way of arteries and veins. We'll go into a whole lot more detail about these later, but the thing to remember first, if you don't already remember it, is that arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins carry it back toward the heart. To differentiate the two, anatomy diagrams typically depict arteries in red while veins are drawn in blue, which incidentally is part of what has led to the common misconception that your blood is actually blue at some point, but it isn't. It is always red. It's just a brighter red when there's oxygen in it. So let's look at how all this comes together, starting with a big burst of blood flowing out of your heart. The right ventricle pumps blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, which is just a big vessel that splits to form the left and right pulmonary arteries. From there, and this is the only time in your body where deoxygenated blood goes through an artery, the blood goes straight through the pulmonary artery into the lungs where it can pick up oxygen. It finds its way into very small, thin-walled capillaries, which allow materials to move in and out of the bloodstream. In the case of the lungs, oxygen moves in and carbon dioxide moves out. The blood then circles back to the heart by way of 4 pulmonary veins, where it keeps moving to the area of lowest pressure, because that is what fluids do, and in this case, that's the inside of the relaxed left atrium. Then the atrium contracts, which increases the pressure, so the blood passes down through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. So the thing that just happened here, where a wave of blood was pumped from the right ventricle to the lungs and then followed the lowest pressure back to the left atrium, there's a name for that. It is the pulmonary circulation loop. It's how your blood unloads its burden of carbon dioxide into the lungs and trades it in for a batch of fresh oxygen. It's short, it's simple, at least in the way I have time to describe it, and it's just delightfully effective. Of all the substances you need to continue existing, oxygen is the most urgent, the one without which you will die in minutes instead of hours or days or weeks. But it's pretty useless unless the oxygen can actually reach your cells, and that hasn't happened yet. For that, that, your newly oxygenated blood needs to travel through the rest of your organ systems and share the wealth. And that fantastic journey, known as the systemic loop, begins in the left ventricle when it flexes to increase pressure. Now, the blood would like to flow into the nice low-pressure left atrium where it just came from, but the mitral valve slams shut, forcing it through the aortic semilunar valve into your body's largest artery, nearly as big around as a garden hose, the aorta, which sends it to the rest of your body. And after all your various greedy muscles and neurons and organs and the heart itself have had their oxygen feast at the capillary bed buffet, that now oxygen-poor blood loops back to the heart, entering through the big superior and inferior vena cava veins straight into the right atrium. And when the right atrium contracts, the blood passes through the tricuspid valve into the relaxed right ventricle and right back to where we started. This whole double loop cycle plays out like a giant figure eight, heart to lung to heart to body to heart again, and runs off that constant high pressure, low pressure gradient exchange regulated by the heart valves. So the first lub that you hear in that lub-dub is made by the mitral and tricuspid valves closing. And they do that because your ventricles contract to build up pressure and pump blood out of the heart. This high pressure caused by ventricular contraction is called systole. Now, the dub sound. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about dubstep sounds. That's the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves closing at the start of diastole. That's when the ventricles relax to receive the next volume of blood from the atria. When those valves close, the high pressure blood that's leaving the heart tries to rush back in, but runs into the valves. So you know when you get your blood pressure measured and the nurse gives you two numbers, like 120/80. The first number is your systolic blood pressure, essentially the peak pressure produced by the contracting ventricles that push blood out to all your tissues. The second reading is your diastolic blood pressure, which is the pressure in your arteries when the ventricles are relaxed. These two numbers give your nurse a sense of how your arteries and ventricles are doing when they're experiencing both high pressure, the systolic, and low pressure, the diastolic. So if your systolic blood pressure is too low, that could mean that, say, the volume of your blood is too low, like maybe you've lost a lot of blood or you're dehydrated. And if your diastolic is too high, that could mean that your blood pressure is high even when it's supposed to be lower. Considering how much we've talked about the importance of homeostasis, it should come as no surprise that blood pressure that's too high or too low, or anything that affects your blood's ability to move oxygen around, can be dangerous. Prolonged high blood pressure can damage arterial walls, mess with your circulation, and ultimately endanger your heart, your lungs, brain, kidneys, and nearly every part of you. So I guess you could say that the best way to break a heart is to mess with its pressure. But good luck trying to write a song about that. Today you learned how the heart's ventricles, atria, and valves create a pump that maintains both high and low pressure to circulate blood from the heart to the body through your arteries and bring it back to the heart through your veins. We also talked about what systolic and diastolic blood pressure are and how they're measured. Thanks to our headmaster of learning, Thomas Frank, and to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible for free through their monthly contributions. If you like Crash Course and you want to help us keep making these videos and also maybe want to get some cool stuff, you can check out patreon.com/crashcourse. Crash Course is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor and editor is Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay. So love that I love that. That's got some of my favorite jokes out of all Crash Course episodes, just because I think it's just because it's about like the heart, and there's so much like music and movies and TV show about like the heart that it's got some of my favorite jokes in there. All right. So looking at our cardiovascular system, let's go ahead and work our way through some of this anatomy, right? Remember, the system as a whole is the heart, your blood, and your blood vessels, right? So we're going to start with the heart here. So the heart is a muscular blood pumping organ, and it's responsible for generating and maintaining pressure. So the heart itself is comprised of cardiac muscle. Okay, and so cardiac muscle is just like any other muscle in the body. It contracts, and so when it contracts, it's obviously changing its shape. And because your heart is a series of chambers, when it changes its shape from being this large to maybe being this large and then relaxing, what that does is that creates like pressure changes. So when the heart contracts, it generates pressure, and when it relaxes, it releases pressure. And that causes blood to want to move out of the heart when your heart is contracting, and blood to want to move into your heart when your heart is relaxing. Because again, stuff will always move to areas of high or areas of low pressure, I should say. So that's your heart. It is muscular. It is comprised of cardiac muscle, and then it's in charge of contracting and generating that pressure. So as we're looking at the heart, it's going to have 4 main chambers here, okay? Now, this is where sometimes the anatomy, the first time you're studying this, it sometimes gets a little bit confusing just because we do want to make sure we're pretty familiar with these 4 chambers here. But what we're going to do is I'm actually going to draw Valentine's heart because that is the only type of heart that I know how to draw. And by draw, I mean I'm going to let paint do it for me. But we're going to divide this heart into some sections here, right? So we're going to divide this into like a middle section. Ooh, oops, I forgot to change that back to a line. We got our left and our right side now, and then we'll have a top and a bottom, right? And there we go. Now we've got sort of 4 quadrants of the heart here. So this side over here, this side of our heart, this is going to be, and this also gets a little bit confusing, but this is the right side of the heart over here, okay? And I know that I'm putting that on the left side, but that is, remember, you got to remember, when we label stuff anatomically, we always label it from the perspective of the client, right? So this is there, you know, like this heart's facing this way, right? So this is the right side, and this is going to be the left side. I'm sure at one point today I'm going to goof up my sides. I almost always do. But that is the left side, and this is the left side over here. This is the right side over here. Then we've also got the top here, and this section here is going to be the bottom. So that is where you are going to find the 4 major quadrants. So we want to be familiar with what these 4 chambers are and what they do, right? So let's just go ahead and imagine, we're gonna go ahead and draw some imaginary chambers in here, right? We'll put a chamber there, we'll put a chamber here, and then it looks like I'm drawing Majora's Mask. And then I'll put a little chamber down here. These are going to be slightly larger chambers. Especially, we'll say this one. This one's really thick and muscular. So those are the various 4 chambers of the heart. By the way, Daryl, this is going to get a little bit challenging just because I do usually use colors to kind of help highlight where the deoxygenated blood is versus the oxygenated, but I'm going to try to put some notes in here that'll make it clear. So if you have, if any questions, guys, at any time, like, stop me. Okay, so these are the various chambers of the heart. These are our 4, we've got our sides this way, and we've got our top and our bottom, right? So the left chamber of the heart, well, actually, let's go ahead and start with just like what these chambers are in general. So the top part of the heart, this is where you are going to find your atriums. Okay, so we'll go ahead and put that in parentheses here. We'll say these are our atriums. Of course, I made it too big. Move my heart here. So these are our atriums on top. So if you think about like what an atrium is, okay, or actually that's atria, right? Because that's the actual plural. There's so those are your atriums, right? So you've got the right atrium over here, and you've got the left atrium over here. If you look up what an atrium is, you'll see it's like a picture. You'll see a bunch of like lobbies. You can see it's like a lobby of like a building, like where, this big empty chamber where you generally, everybody kind of gathers up before they decide to go wherever it is that they're going. That's what an atrium is in architecture. It's a giant empty gathering site. That's actually what your atriums are here as well. So your atriums are going to gather blood that has returned back to the heart. Okay, and that's what their job is, right? So you're going to have your right atrium and your left atrium, and both of those are going to gather blood as it returns to the heart when your heart relaxes. So when your heart relaxes, this chamber opens up and it's empty. there's very little pressure in there, right? So fluid is naturally going to want to move to that area of low pressure. So the atrium is slowly going to fill up with blood, right? Then what's going to happen is there's going to be some little valves in here that will close down. And then these chambers down here, which are your ventricles, they're going to open up afterwards. And then all that blood is going to rush into this area of low pressure, right? So it'll rush from the atriums down into the ventricles. And the ventricles is where the real heavy lifting of pumping blood out of the heart takes place. So when your heart squeezes, now there's all, imagine the heart contracts here. This chamber gets squeezed, this chamber gets squeezed. So now there's like a lot of pressure inside these two chambers here. So what happens is blood goes rushing out of the heart. So your heart relaxes and blood fills your atriums. And when it contracts, it ejects blood from the ventricles. And those ventricles are going to pump blood away. So the bottom of the heart are your ventricles. Now, the left side of the heart, which is over here, is probably what we mostly think of when we think of like what our heart does and what its like main job is and all that. Like when we're mostly talking about like the heart, we're usually talking about like the left side of the heart, just because like, it's like, yeah, my heart pumps blood out of me, right? Well, that's what your left side does. Your right side pumps blood over to your lungs, but let's go ahead and start with the left side here. So the left side of the heart, this is what we refer to as our systemic circuit. Okay, so systemic circuit means that like this is the system, right? That's getting all of the oxygen and like delivery. You are the system, by the way. So like when you are pumping blood throughout your entire body, it's traveling through your systemic circuit, right? But over here on the right side, this is your pulmonary circuit. So remember, we have to be able to get blood over to the lungs, right? Like we have to be able to get blood to the lungs so they can pick up oxygen. That's where your pulmonary circuit comes in, right? So the right side of the heart is all deoxygenated, right? This is where deoxygenated blood, which we'll put in blue here. If we look at like where blood's going to travel, right? It's going to kind of come in, some of it from the top here. It'll kind of come in and then it'll travel kind of behind here. I guess we'll go like this, right? And then it's going to kind of come out into this chamber here, right? And so there's where some blood is like traveling, right? And then there's another chamber down below that kind of comes from behind the heart, kind of like this, and it comes in like right here. And that's your pulmonary circuit. Now, we drew this in blue because this is deoxygenated blood. This is blood that's really rich in CO2, right? This is all the blood that's already dropped off all of its oxygen, right? So that's your CO2 there, right? So this is, and we'll go ahead and label that. We'll say this is deoxygenated blood. Okay, so low oxygen blood. Okay. And then this is still going to be deoxygenated blood, because what's going to happen then is it's going to move from this chamber to the next one, right? All that blood is then going to drop into this chamber here, right? And then eventually that's going to get pumped out and it's going to travel over to the lungs, to the left and the right side. So, there's going to be a little valve that kind of comes up this way and it'll split. I guess, how do I draw a valve splitting like that? It kind of splits like that and then travels its way over to like the lungs on both sides. I'm going to erase all that, but that's where blood's going to travel next, right? So then it's going to travel out of the heart to the lungs, right? So this is going to pump. So actually, you know what? We're going to say gathers deoxygenated blood. So that's what it's doing. It's gathering deoxygenated blood. And then this side is pumping deoxygenated blood, right? This is pumping that blood. I gotta find a way to get this to freaking fit. There it is. I'm gonna straddle the line there. Oh, oops. Hold on. Oxygenated. So that's what's happening right there. This is pumping that blood out, right? That's what the ventricle is going to be responsible for. So it's going to pump blood, out of this chamber. It's going to kind of go up like this, and then it will come out like over here that way. And then it will come out because it kind of comes, I guess it'd be easier. Well, so we're going to kind of imagine like this line is going this way. that's not quite where it's at. It actually kind of goes a little higher than the heart, but just to keep this a little bit clear here, it's going to go this way. And so that's where it's going to go. And then some of it is going to come out from behind over on the other side of the heart as well, because you got two lungs, right? You got to get to both sides. So this little like thing here is going to kind of split. We'll sort of imagine this is traveling behind the heart here. So it kind of splits like that behind the heart and eventually becomes, this chamber and that chamber over there. So that's where blood's traveling at first. Now, here's the thing. Now blood has made it to your lungs, right? And your lungs are where it's going to pick up a whole bunch of oxygen. It's also going to drop off all the CO2, right? Remember, it's got all this CO2 over here in the blood. And so we're going to get rid of that. We're going to get rid of that at the lungs. And then now all your blood is going to turn bright red, right? Because it's going to pick up a bunch of oxygen. And when oxygen binds to the hemoglobin in your blood, it becomes this bright red color. So then blood's going to come back this direction. I'm going to move my drawing one more time just to give myself a little bit more room again. Trying to make sure this is like big enough for you guys to be able to see. So then blood's going to come back from the lungs, and this time it's going to be bright red. So this is going to be highly oxygenated blood. Okay, and so we're going to see it travel kind of this way, right? And blood flows coming from the lungs, right? And it's going this way. This one's a little shorter this time, right? And then it's going to dump in right here, and it's going to dump in right here, right? And that's these chambers. If we imagine these, this one's going to come all the way over here, and this one's going to, eventually, what drawing? It's going to work its way this way, right? So now this is going to, because it's an atrium, it's the top part of our heart, it is going to gather oxygenated blood, right? This time it's not deoxygenated, it's oxygenated. It just got back from the lungs. It could not have more oxygen in it, like this is definitely the most oxygen it's going to have. And then we're going to drop from this chamber over to this chamber over here, where it's going to take that oxygenated blood and it's going to dump it into the left ventricle, which is going to pump oxygenated blood, right? This is going to pump the highly oxygenated stuff, right? I guess it says pumping. And that's what it does, right? So now you can kind of see, and then when I say it pumps oxygenated blood, what I mean is it's going to travel up this huge blood vessel that I'm going to show you in just a second. It's going to travel up this giant vessel called your aorta. And that's going to send all the blood out to the body. Okay, in the same way that these over here were pumping out to the lungs, right? So this ventricle is pumping blood out to the entire body there, right? So we'll go ahead and put that down here. We'll say our left ventricle, see right over here, pushes oxygenated blood out of the heart so that it can be delivered throughout the body. The right ventricle pumps deoxygenated blood over to the lungs so that it can pick up oxygen and drop off its CO2. So both ventricles are going to eject blood out of the heart whenever the heart squeezes. The right ventricle goes to the lungs a couple inches away, and the left ventricle has to pump it throughout your entire body. So here's my advice for memorizing these chambers, guys, because this can kind of be a pain in the butt the first time you're trying to memorize this stuff. Here's what I want you to remember. Remember the left ventricle. Remember this guy right here. This is the chamber that we're most commonly talking about. When you're measuring your pulse, right, as blood goes rushing past your carotid artery, or when you're measuring your pulse on your wrist, as blood goes rushing past there, you are basically feeling when the left ventricle is sending blood through your body. Right? Like that's your left ventricle squeezing, like bump, 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 bump. That's the left ventricle squeezing every single time. You're just feeling blood as it's getting squeezed there, right? So that's the one I want you to remember. If you remember the left ventricle, you'll be able to figure out all the rest of them, right? Because this is just a logic square. You know, you've got the left ventricle in the bottom right-hand corner, which obviously means that we have the right ventricle on the opposite side, right? So there's our if we got our left ventricle here, then obviously my other one's my right ventricle. And if I remember that my left ventricle pumps blood to the body, I'll remember that the other place that blood gets pumped to, my right ventricle, is going to the lungs. I can just remember one to help me remember the other. You know, up is the opposite of down. Lex Luthor is the opposite of Superman. You know what I mean? Like it's always kind of helpful to memorize things in their reverse. Get the yin to your yang. You know what I mean? So if the left ventricle is pumping blood throughout the body, the right ventricle is going to pump blood over to the lungs. And then ventricles are the opposites of atriums. Ventricles eject blood from the heart. Atriums gather blood. So my left atrium is attached to my left ventricle. Therefore, I know that the left atrium is going to gather oxygenated blood because the left ventricle pumps that oxygenated blood throughout the body, right? I'm not going to pump deoxygenated blood throughout the body, right? I'm not going to gather deoxygenated blood here so I can pump it around and like, you know, be like, hey, foot, I know you need some energy. Here's some blood that doesn't have any oxygen in it, right? Doesn't make any sense. So that's how I'm going to remember that. And then again, I'm just going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to say, okay, well, if that's what the left atrium does, then the right atrium does exactly the opposite. It gathers the oxygenated stuff. So this is kind of what your heart looks like. So let's take a look at the actual heart here. So if you look at the various chambers of the heart, you'll see it kind of looks like this. Oh, that's the worst. I hate it when I get these. So you can see like it fills up these top chambers first, right? The blue deoxygenated side over here, the red oxygenated side over here. It fills up here and then it drops into the ventricles. And then when the ventricles squeeze, some of it travels up and it goes over here. And some of it goes over here. That's going to the lungs. And then it comes back from the lungs to these little tubes here. And there'd be another set of tubes coming in on this side actually, here. And then it goes down here. And then that's where it gets pumped out of this huge blood vessel right here, which you'll notice this is called your aorta, and this arch right here, that's called your aortic arch. It's this huge little arch. Some of it goes up to the brain, and then the rest of it loops down behind and drops behind the heart and goes throughout the rest of the body. That becomes your entire rest of your vascular system. So if we look at the vascular system here, there you can actually see all the various parts of it, right? The red stuff is your arteries, and the blue stuff is your veins as they're traveling out. So they all travel out of the heart to the various like different sections that they're going. So that is the chambers of the heart in a nutshell, right? So the left atrium gathers the oxygenated blood, and the right atrium gathers the deoxygenated. The left ventricle pushes oxygenated blood throughout the body, and the right ventricle pushes oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Now, I will say, let's take a look, one more picture of the heart here. Here's another easy way to remember the left ventricle. Trying to find a very clear version of this. I guess that works. Okay, take a look at this picture here. You will notice, and it's kind of faint, it's kind of hard to tell, but see how this wall right here is much thicker than this wall over here. And then they kind of share this thin wall. And then there's a lot more meat at the bottom here than there is on this side as well. So this left ventricle has more muscle surrounding it, which is why this side of the heart squeezes a little bit harder than this side over here. And that makes a lot of sense when you consider that this right side of the heart over here only has to pump blood a couple inches over to your lungs. And the left side of the heart over here has to pump blood all the way from your heart to your right pinky toe, which is a really long ways away. And it has to pump blood against gravity up to the brain as well, right? So that's another way to remember the left ventricle. And that's why I always give people the tip. Memorize the left ventricle and the rest of the heart will make sense to you. It all kind of comes together after that. So those are the 4 chambers of the heart. Any questions about how those chambers are operating, or is there anything I can do to make this a little bit clearer?
Actually, it was very clear to me.
Love.
Yeah, great delivery on that.
Yeah.
Love that. Luckily, we revisit this. I think we revisit this in 3 of the 4 modules. Like we're going to come back to this next mod in about 6 weeks. We'll see this again. But yeah, just make sure it gets a little bit clearer every time. But if we don't have any questions, let's go ahead and talk about heart muscle here, because it's the personal training course if we want to talk about muscles. So let's go ahead and take a look at the various different layers of the heart. So zooming into the heart a little bit, right? You can actually kind of see we got different like chambers here, but let's get out of the chambers and let's take a look at heart muscle. Heart muscle layers. They don't have a picture in my PowerPoint. So these are kind of what the walls of your heart actually look like. This is kind of fun, but you can see here, there's going to be several different layers inside the heart. The first one is going to be known as what is called your epicardium. Okay, so the epicardium is this layer right here. Now, this is what is somewhat confusing because they're not mentioning, they're not going to mention your pericardium. So, in your heart, you actually have the heart itself is comprised of 3 layers, right? The outer layer, the inner layer, the middle layer. Okay. But there is a technical 4th layer that you can see in this picture here called the pericardium. Pericardium's not, this is so weird. It's not actually part of your heart. It is in the sense that like it's holding your heart in place. But it doesn't have any contractile abilities, and it's not part of like the heart's anatomy. It's actually part of your fascial system, like all the fascia that runs throughout your body. If you look at your body fascia, right? Fascia is this like connective tissue that just kind of runs around the body and holds, oh, no, not shopping, images. Kind of holds your body in place, right? Like all the webbing, you know, that's kind of like all the pieces of tape that's like, you know, like when you're being put together, you know, like it's all the stuff that's like holding you in place, right? That's what fascia is. Actually, oh, I love that picture. That's kind of a cool idea of like, you know, sort of how fascia works. It's like a webbing that kind of connects all of us together, right? So you have what's called your pericardium. And your pericardium is this fibrous sac. This is actually a picture of a heart here. You can see it's at all the blood drained out of it. So the tissues, sort of the classic, just like this is, by the way, this is the color that all of us actually are. I know we think of meat as being like red, but that's only because it has a lot of blood in it. You take all the blood away, it kind of looks like this color. So you can see there, this is the sac right? But if you cut that sac away, there's the actual heart. This is the heart, but this sac around the outside, that's your pericardium. So your pericardium is this sac, actually, that's a great picture right there, of connective tissue that kind of holds your heart in place. And that way your heart doesn't drop out of your chest. Has anybody in here ever heard of Marfan's syndrome? Daryl, actually, in particular, I'm curious if you've heard of this, because this, I know you're a big basketball guy.
I have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have.
So it's kind of a bummer. You might be able to remember who this actually is, but so Marfan syndrome is we talk about the NBA a lot when we talk about this, but what it is, it's a connective tissue disorder. And you'll usually see people who are very long and lanky, right? And you're like, man, that's a very lanky person. And the reason why is because they have this connective tissue disorder. And it's where basically their connective tissue is very elastic, rather than being like kind of stiff the way it's supposed to be. So what you'll see is people with very long limbs, which often leads to them, you know, a lot of people don't know they have this disease. They'll have like a really minor version of it. You know, we'll see. I mean, obviously there's some very extreme pictures here, but a lot of times they won't know that they're suffering. They won't know they have Marfan syndrome. And then this is such a bummer. What'll happen is they'll play sports. They'll get into basketball because they're like, oh, I'm tall, I should play basketball. And they'll get really good at basketball and they'll play for like a really long time. And then like they'll get to the NBA. And the NBA will do a genetic test to find out if they have Marfan syndrome. And the NBA doesn't allow people who have this disease to play because it's a connective tissue disorder. And your pericardium, this layer of the heart, right, that surrounds the heart, it's connective tissue that holds your heart in the center of your chest. And so if your connective tissue is really flexible, your heart can technically, if you get hit really hard one day, it can actually fall out of your chest, and that's the end of it. I mean, it's going to come, you know, disconnected. So the NBA,
That's what
like,
happened to Sharif O'Neal.
is that who it is? Who is it?
Yeah, it was Sharif O'Neal. That's what happened to his son. He got hit really hard in the chest in the game at LSU, and he had that.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's crazy. That's Shaq's kid.
But he's.
I didn't know he had that. That's interesting.
He actually is playing with the Lakers this year for their G League affiliate team. So, and he's going to be playing summer league with the Lakers. So he might actually get the chance to play. Just because
that's interesting. Son. They would have to change, because the last I heard about somebody with Marfan's, the NBA did a really cool thing. It was some college prospect. I don't remember who it was, but they drafted him and then they let him retire, you know, like in the same minute, basically, because they were like,
oh, yeah, that wasn't too long ago.
It was like a ceremony, and I was like, that's so cool. Like, you can always say that he made it to the NBA. I was like, oh man, because he had no idea he had that condition, like, until they did that test, and then they wouldn't let him play. But that's why your pericardium, I use this story as an example of like why your pericardium is so important. It's not officially part of your heart, but it does hold your heart in the chamber. So we always got to talk about that while we're here. Weirdly, it's not in my notes today, but so your pericardium is this outer sac that holds your heart in place. But the official 3 layers of the heart, just like you're going to see 3 layers of like muscle, you're going to see 3 layers of pretty much everything in the body. Your body is always arranged this way. You get the inner layer, which is really smooth. That's the inner portion of the cell wall. You've got the outer layer, which is usually a little bit rough and protective. And then you get the middle layer, and the middle layer is very muscular. Look at how big this middle layer is, right? So there's the outer layer. There's the inner layer. Now, I know that this looks kind of interesting. You look at this inner layer here, and it's kind of got like these little holes in it. But if you actually look at this tissue, if you really zoom in, this is exceptionally smooth. Weirdly, in this picture, I know it looks a little rougher, but the actual like branches themselves are all extremely smooth. This is the inner chambers of your heart. The endocardium, if we look at the inner walls, this is endocardium tissue right here. Okay, this is epicardium tissue out here. That's the outer stiff layer. And then this middle section is your myocardium. That's the muscular layer. And look at how freaking thick this section is, right? I didn't do this on purpose, but you can actually kind of see, like, this is a little thicker, this is a little thinner. Like, actually kind of works to show us these different layers. If I had done these in different, versions. So like, there's the outer, innermost layer, that's the endocardium. We'll say this is the outermost layer, that's the epicardium. And then all this space in between is the myocardium. Myo meaning muscular. Whenever you hear the word myo, think muscular. It's the thick muscular layer in the middle. And that's when we're talking about cardiac muscle, that's what we're talking about. Okay. So the epicardium, outermost layer of the heart, myocardium, middle layer of the heart, extremely muscular, extremely thick compared to the other layers, and no more muscular and no thicker than in that left ventricle, right? The left ventricle, I mean, look at how much, this is a great picture to kind of highlight what I mean, but look at how thick this section surrounding the left ventricle is. And that's because the left ventricle has to pump this freaking blood from your heart all the way down to your feet, which are not close, whereas like the right side of the heart, its job is easy, right? Just got to pump it a couple inches over to the lungs. So that is the various layers of the heart, right? Those 3 different layers there. Now, when we're talking about the heart contracting, we're talking about the myocardium, right? The myocardium, your heart muscle, is responsible for that contraction, right? And it's going to do this. If you look at like the volume of blood that's being ejected, depending on how much blood you have, and everybody's going to have a little bit different amounts of blood, the volume of blood in each ventricle is averaging about 130 milliliters at rest. Okay, so there's going to be a little bit of blood that is in the ventricles when you are at rest. So when your heart relaxes and all that blood comes rushing in, the average amount of blood that you're going to find there is about 130 milliliters per chamber. Okay, the chambers, by the way, are about the same size. It's the muscle surrounding those chambers. The chamber sizes are about the same, but the muscle surrounding it is very different. So then when the heart squeezes, right, you'll be left with about 58 milliliters of blood. So most of it gets ejected, right? Most of the blood goes flying out of there, right? Not all of it, it's not perfect, but a good chunk of it is going to get ejected out of there. Just like if you were to have like, a bottle with some water in it and you squeeze, most of it would go flying out of there if you left, or if I squeeze like this and then I just like, actually, I guess I can do it like this.
We used to do that back in high school. Twist the bottle, twist the middle of it.
Right, yeah, you need to twist it to really get the pressure. I was hoping it would go flying off of there. Yeah, we used to shoot the caps at each other. But yeah, like that's it goes shooting off of there because there's so much pressure in there and there's very little pressure out here. Same thing's happening in your heart. Your heart squeezes, pressure goes out. So we got to talk about like how the heart's actually going to contract here, right? I want you to understand these. Yeah, I want to make sure I'm not stepping on my future toes. Let's go ahead and take a look at like how these heart signals actually work. This is going to help us understand muscles, by the way, and down the line when we get into muscular anatomy, this is actually going to help us understand how that works as well. But let's take a look here at oh wow, that's a sunburned person. Oh, sorry, that caught my eye. That poor man. Let's look at the heart throbs here. So let's look at our heart muscle.
Lately, I've been waking up in the middle of the night and my heart's just racing.
How your heart's pacemaker You've seen this before in a TV show or a movie. A patient is on the table in the emergency room bleeding from a stab wound or having OD'd on drugs when suddenly an alarm goes off and the beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor flatlines. It's cardiac arrest, and you can tell just by that sound that it's terrible. Doctors swarm around barking orders, and McDreamy or Dr. Gray or whoever the latest foxy doctor is on the TV show that you're addicted to grabs the paddles and pushes them down on the patient's chest and is all, "Clear!" Then the patient's chest jumps up and everyone stares at the monitor waiting for those steady beeps to reappear. That is a pretty classic scene. When it comes to medical crises you see in popular culture, it's probably only rivaled by the poolside CPR scene or someone shaking an unconscious body, pounding on their chest and saying, "Don't you die on me!" Which, hopefully you know, is no way to keep someone alive. These are classic script tropes, but they contribute to some misconceptions about how defibrillators, CPR, and the electricity of the heart work. Because the truth is, CPR can help prolong heart function during cardiac arrest, but it usually can't save a life without help from a defibrillator. And when McDreamy, may he rest in peace, finally bursts out those paddles, that high voltage shock isn't turning the heart back on, it's actually stopping it. Confused? Well, I am here to get your head to understand your heart. We'll get back to hot TV doctors in a couple of minutes, I promise. But in order to understand what's actually going on during cardiac arrest, we have to understand some basics about your heart cells. We've learned a lot about skeletal muscle tissue, how it's striated and contracts using the actin-myosin sliding filament dance you've heard so much about. Your cardiac muscle is also striated and uses sliding filaments to contract, but the similarities end there. For one, their cells look pretty different. Skeletal muscle tissue has long multinucleate cells, while cardiac cells are squat, branched out, and interconnected, each one with one or two central nuclei. The cells are separated by a loose matrix of connective tissue called the endomysium, which is chock full of capillaries to serve up a constant supply of oxygen. Cardiac cells are also loaded with energy-generating mitochondria. In fact, mitochondria take up as much as 25 to 35% of each cell, making it resistant to fatigue, which is partly why your heart can beat nearly 3 billion times in a lifetime. Not surprisingly, the differences between skeletal and cardiac muscle tissues are key to understanding their functions. Skeletal muscle fibers are both structurally and functionally separate from each other, meaning that some cells can work while others don't. That's why you can grasp a delicate flower with the same hand that you can use to crush a soda can. Cardiac cells, on the other hand, are both physically and electrically connected all of the time. It takes precise coordination to create the high and low pressures required to pump your blood, after all, and cardiac cells need to be linked in order to have that perfect timing. And there's one more thing you need to know about your heart cells. Some of them can generate their own electricity. How in the name of Raymond de Vousons can that be? Well, rewind your brain to when we explored the electrical marvel that is the action potential and how it triggers both neurons and muscle cells. That process started by depolarizing the cell, that is, pushing the cell's membrane potential from negative toward positive past a threshold that triggered voltage-gated ion channels to open. Most cells in your body only depolarize after being triggered by an external stimulus or by a neighboring cell in a long chain reaction of action potentials that's set off by the nervous system. But that is not the case for a special group of cells found only in your heart, ones that can trigger their own depolarization. These are your pacemaker cells. Pacemaker cells are what keep your heart beating at the correct rhythm and ensure that each cardiac muscle cell contracts in coordination with the others, because you don't want your brain to have to send a series of action potentials every time you need your heart to beat. Your brain has got other stuff to do. So pacemaker cells are, in a way, your heart's very own brain, generating the initial spark that sends a current through your heart's internal wiring system, known as the intrinsic cardiac conduction system. This system transmits electricity along a precisely timed pathway that ends with atrial and ventricular contractions, also known as heartbeats. And it begins with pacemaker cells generating their own action potentials. In most cells, the action potential starts with the resting potential, which the cell maintains by pumping sodium ions out and potassium ions in, right? Then, when some stimulus causes the sodium channels to open up, the sodium ions flood back in, which raises the membrane potential until it reaches its threshold. Pacemaker cells operate the same way, except for that initial stimulus. They don't need it. Their membranes are dotted with leaky sodium and potassium channels that don't require any external triggers. Instead, as their channels let sodium ions trickle in, they cause the membrane potential to slowly and inevitably drift toward its threshold. Since the leaking happens at a steady rate, the cells fire off action potentials like clockwork, and the leakier the membrane gets, the faster it triggers action potentials. The pacemaker cells at the start of the conduction system have the leakiest membranes, and therefore the fastest inherent inherent rhythms, so they control the rate of the entire heart. And those fast, leaky cells are found in the Sinoatrial Node, or the SA node, up in the right atria. They essentially turn the whole SA node into your natural pacemaker. After those pacemaker cells make themselves fire, they spread their electrical impulses to cardiac muscle cells throughout the atria. The impulses leap across synapse-like connections between the cells called gap junctions and continue down the conduction system until they reach the Atrioventricular Node, or AV node, located just above the tricuspid valve. Now, when the signal hits the AV node, it actually gets delayed for like 1/10 of a second, so the atria can finish contracting before the ventricles contract. Without that delay, all the chambers would squeeze at once, and the blood would just splash around and not go anywhere. So instead, the atria contract and blood drops down into the ventricles, and then a moment later, the signal moves on and triggers the ventricles to squeeze, making the blood flow out of the heart. And there are two tricks to a good ventricular contraction. One, the ventricles are so large that the signal has to be distributed evenly to ensure a coordinated contraction. And two, the ventricles need to squeeze like they're squeezing a tube of toothpaste from the bottom up to accelerate the blood through the big arteries at the top of the heart. So from the AV node, the signal travels straight down to the inferior end of the heart and gets distributed to both sides. The path the electrical impulse takes to the bottom of the heart is called the atrioventricular bundle, also known by the more rad name the bundle of His, where it branches out to the left and right ventricles. Finally, the signal disperses out into Purkinje fibers, which trigger depolarization in all surrounding cells, causing the ventricles to contract from the bottom up like toothpaste tubes, at which point the whole cycle starts all over again. And everything I just described to you, from when the SA node fires to when the last of the ventricular cells contract, takes about 220 milliseconds. So that is how your heart beats. But I know what you want. You want to get back to talking about TV shows and McDreamy and his paddles. It's totally understandable. Okay, so picture all your individual heart cells as a bunch of musicians in an orchestra. They all sound really great together, but then the conductor suddenly needs to go to the bathroom. And it sounds okay at first, but then the tuba gets a little weird and the triangles half a beat off, and soon everyone is playing a different note at a different time, jamming to their own personal rhythm. In the heart, we call this out-of-sync behavior fibrillation, and it can be caused by all sorts of problems, especially ones that affect the pacemaker cells in the SA node. In an orchestra, this just sounds really terrible. In a heart, there's no coordinated contraction, no lub-dub, no blood moving through the body, which means you will soon be dead. But then the conductor comes back from the bathroom break, taps her wand, and everybody stops. It's silent for a second before the wand comes up, and then they all start playing again, this time in unison. If your heart in fibrillation is an out-of-sync orchestra, then a defibrillator is that conductor. It stops the chaotic noise by overriding all the individuals and hits a sort of reset button, so everyone can start again on the same page. The paddles send so much electricity through the heart that they trigger action potentials in all of the cells at once. Then the cells repolarize and start leaking again, and the most leaky cells in the pacemaker SA node reach their threshold and fire first, resetting the rhythm that keeps everyone in harmony so your heart functions properly. And that is how hot doctors and their paddles actually stop hearts to save lives. Now, the thing about CPR, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation, is that it can't correct fibrillation. What those chest compressions can do is force a fibrillating heart to keep circulating oxygenated blood until help arrives. But if a person is in cardiac arrest, just breathing into their mouth and compressing their chest won't deliver the electricity needed to give the pacemaking cells a chance to reset. I think I just figured out why they call those TV doctors heartthrobs. It's a terrible joke. Anyway, today you learned how your heart's pacemaker cells use leaky membranes to generate their own action potentials, and how the resulting electricity travels through the cardiac conduction pathway from SA node to Purkinje fibers, allowing your heart to contract. And if you weren't too busy daydreaming about TV doctors, you also learned how defibrillators work to reset the rhythm of your heart. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Thomas Frank, and to all of our Patreon patrons who help make Crash Course possible through their monthly contributions, not just to themselves, but to everyone in the world for free. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making these videos, you can visit patreon.com/crashcourse. Crash Course is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. The episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiPastino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor and editor is Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay. Sorry, I always try to make sure that we're going through the credits, just so I think it helps with me not getting copyright strike. That kind of showed us how like these different signals in the heart actually get made. So one of the coolest parts of your heart, if you look at your heart's conduction system, you'll notice that there's some wires that kind of run through your heart. you can see, yeah, kind of. This is kind of what they actually look like all by themselves. And then we'll show them in the chambers here. I think that'll work. So you take a look right here. You can see in the right atrium, and this is your heart, right? You get your right atrium here. You get your right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. So here, right here, in the is the sinoatrial node, right? This is the main pacemaker of the heart, right here, all by itself. You can see. So the sinoatrial node is your SA node. That's what you'll usually hear people call it. It's the pacemaker of the heart. This is responsible for connecting with your nervous system to know what rhythm to make your heart. Your sinoatrial node is what sets your heart's rhythm. Okay. In the video, it was the conductor for the orchestra, right? So your sinoatrial node creates that rhythm. Now, it's connected to this other node right here. This node right here, that's your AV node. That's your atrioventricular node. And what's kind of funny about the AV node is it delays the signal. Now, you might be wondering, why would we want to delay the signal? Like, if we created it, why would there be this wire directly afterwards that sort of insulates the signal and pauses it for just a second? Well, if you look here, notice how there's some other wires that kind of run down through the heart, and they take a little bit longer to get to that AV node, right, than this really short one right here. And then there's this wire that kind of runs across the top of the heart as well. And that actually, because of, and you can't really, I don't know why they didn't draw that here, but there should be a wire up here up top as well. Why did this wire here run across the top of the heart? Well, that part of the heart, that's going to allow, when this signal gets created, it's going to travel across the top of the heart first. And that's actually what allows the top of the heart to squeeze, then relax. And by time it's relaxing, the other part of the heart is now, because the signal was delayed, going to allow this to contract. And so that's why you'll actually notice, if you look at the heartbeat, you'll notice the top of your heart finishes contracting before the bottom does, right? It sort of goes bup, 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 bup. 1, 2, 3, 4, lub, dub. And that's your actual heartbeat, right? Not this. But that's the top of the heart squeezes, and then the bottom of the heart squeezes afterwards. So it creates this rhythm, right? And that rhythm is actually what allows us to ensure that, like, if I go here, and then I open up, blood rushes in, and then blood rushes into here, then blood, gets pushed into the air, or it can rush into there, so then it squeezes into there, right? That's what's moving blood from the top to the bottom out of the heart. So if we actually look at like heart, so I'm gonna find a picture of that. You can kind of see there's your heart actually filling up. And that's kind of what the overall rhythm really looks like there. So that's happening because your sinoatrial node starts the signal, finishes contracting the top of the heart, then allows it to travel down to the bottom part of the heart, and allows the AV signal. So the AV signal kind of delays it for a second, and then allows it to travel to the rest. And the rest of these are, there's some names for them. They call these your Purkinje fibers, heart. I closed it. Conduction system. You'll see those kind of branch out there. So there's like the SA node, there's the AV node, and then it branches out into all of the different parts of the ventricles there. Those are your Purkinje fibers. And then there's this bundle over here as it splits out, which is called the bundle of His. HIS, but I think that's also a really great name for like a heavy metal band, the bundle of His. But those are the various like layers of the heart, or those are the various wires running through the heart that allow the heart to contract at that sort of specific rhythm. So now that we understand, like, all that electricity running through the heart, right, creating those contractions, let's go ahead and get out of the heart here, and let's take a look at some of our blood vessels. Blood vessels are luckily a little bit easier to understand than the heart itself, but they are arranged kind of similarly. So your circulatory system, your blood vessels, is a closed circuit, like we said earlier, of about 60,000 miles of tubes inside your body, if you were to stretch them all end to end. That is how microscopically small these blood vessels are. That is big enough, by the way, to go around the Earth, I think 2.5 times. What is the diameter of the Earth? Is 7,000. Oh no, it's only 7,000. 60,000 divided by 7,917. So you could go around the Earth 7.5 times with your blood vessels. That's how small some of these are. 60,000 miles worth. These are going to get very microscopic. So if you look at your blood vessels, and by the way, as another example of like the bodies exhibit, everybody should go see the bodies exhibit. It is absolutely amazing. But if you go look at it, you can see that is how blood vessels basically cover all of your various tissues. They form these like microscopic, and this is the thing, you can't actually see all of them. They can only get so small in the bodies, like, the people who are making these diagrams and stuff, they can only get so microscopic. They can only get so small. So many of your blood vessels cannot be seen because they are so tiny. In fact, here's a really weird fact about your blood itself. So your blood cells are the smallest cells in your body. Okay, blood cells are the smallest. Weirdly enough, your blood vessels are sometimes smaller than the blood cells. And that seems impossible. You're like, how could the tube that something travels through be smaller than the thing that's traveling through it, right? Like, how could that be possible? Well, that's because of the shape of your red blood cells. Your red blood cells are that sort of filled in donut shape, right? They kind of look like, they kind of look like a little donut that's like filled in. So they can actually, because of that, fold really easily and sort of squeeze themselves. That allows them to sort of squeeze and fold and change shape there to be able to fit through. So you can kind of see there's like a folded red blood cell. That's actually might be a picture of like a clot or something, but the principle is kind of the same. You can see, actually, there we go. See how it's kind of getting squeezed there to be able to fit through this kind of tiny junction. It actually does it on purpose because, like, if enough red blood cells start cramming into one of them that's squeezed, it's like, and it goes popping out the other side, which actually increases your blood pressure in a good way. That actually is one of the reasons why blood is able to travel its way back up to the heart against gravity, is because we need to sort of increase our pressure, enough to allow it to get up there. We'll talk about how that also happens thanks to veins here in a second. So that's what your cardiorespiratory, that's your circulatory system. It's a system of 60,000 miles worth of tubing, right? And it's responsible for, covering the various tissues of the body to allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to move around, right? Oxygen gets delivered to tissues, CO2 gets picked up from those tissues, and then our body can, transport that to the lungs to get rid of it. So let's go ahead and make it clear as to what these blood vessels are. So you have got what are called arteries. Arteries are the largest blood vessels, okay? So we're gonna go ahead and just like draw an artery here. Okay, so this is an artery. Arteries are very large. Now, arteries are going to branch into smaller and smaller tubes, which we are going to call arterial. Whoops. We're going to call those arterioles. So arterioles are kind of small. Okay, they'll be like a little bit thinner and a little bit tinier than your arteries. So these are arterioles. Remember yesterday we had our bronchi and then we had our bronchioles. Same naming system here, right? Arteries are big, arterioles are slightly smaller. And actually, while I'm at it, you know what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make this wall just a little bit thicker. That actually is sort of an important part of this. Let's make that wall thicker as well. So there's sort of our thick wall there. So then we've got arteries, we've got arterioles, right? Now, the opposite of an artery is going to be a vein, okay? Veins are a little bit smaller than arteries, but not like substantially. So if we look at like a vein here, go back to, yeah, we'll go that one. We'll make them slightly smaller, you know, than the artery there, but not like crazy small. So those are your veins, right? And then you've also got smaller versions of veins, which we are going to call a venule. So again, artery, arterial, vein, venule, right? So venules are going to be slightly smaller. So there's our next tube there, and that's our venule. Okay. Now, the next one that we've got are our capillaries. Now, capillaries, I'm going to go ahead and put these in purple here. These have got the smallest. These are absolutely tiny. So honestly, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go like this. These are really meant to be microscopic. That is how small those freaking tubes can get sometimes. So this is going to be our capillaries. Okay, so that's sort of the difference in the size of these tubes here, right? Now, in arteries, arteries are just big, empty tubes. Arterioles, big, empty tubes. Capillaries, big, empty tubes. Venules, big, empty tubes, but full-on veins actually have these specialized little valves in them. And these valves kind of look like this. Oh, I'm doing that in the wrong direction. Like that. They kind of look like that. These little valves here are able to shut and close down. So that allows blood, you know, to travel through those veins. They can really only go in one particular direction, because what's going to happen is, like, let's say like it moves through, like this valve is open, that valve's open, and then this one's shut, right? So if blood traveled here and then it tries to fall back, like let's say it tries to fall back this way, it's not going to be able to. It's not going to continue blood. This is actually what allows our veins to ensure that blood only travels in the direction that it's supposed to go. Those little valves close down. So that's sort of what happens. So now let's imagine, you know, sort of the journey of a red blood cell, right? It would start by traveling through like a really large artery, right? So we'll have like a big freaking tube here, right? And this is coming from the heart. So the heart would be over here. So our heart's that way, which means this blood's traveling this way, okay? So blood is traveling in this direction. Let me actually know what I'll do. Let's we'll put the heart over here. Right? So there's our big artery, right? So blood's traveling this way. And then that artery gets a little bit smaller, and then it's going to branch off, okay? So then it's going to branch like this into even smaller tubes. And now it's going to become like an arteriole, right? And then like that arteriole is going to branch into smaller and smaller tubes. And smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually it becomes like capillaries. Okay, and so capillaries are going to form this kind of bed, and I'm just going to kind of like draw some squiggles here to sort of represent that bed, right? That all kind of come together. Now we're drawing this in purple because you'll usually see people draw like the left, half of it in red and half of it in blue. I like purple because it's like kind of right in the middle between the two. And that's really what's happening in capillaries, right? This is like some deoxygenated blood and some oxygenated blood, right? Like some of the blood cells that are in, covering this tissue are dropping off the oxygen. Some of them are picking up the CO2, depends on like sort of what stage, what part of the cycle they're in. So those are all of our capillaries. And then eventually our capillaries are going to come together and they'll go like this, right? Like they'll start kind of coming together until eventually they become like a venule, right? So we'll have like this kind of like thin blood vessel here, and then like more would come, right? Like more venules would come and attach to that, right? Until eventually like they all kind of come together and form like a full-on vein. And then that vein would eventually work its way back over to the heart. And that is sort of this closed circuit. So the big section here, this really large section is an artery. This slightly smaller section are the arterioles. This right here is a capillary bed. Then the capillary bed starts to come together and become venules until eventually it becomes a full-on vein. And then it gets back to the heart. So here's what you need to remember, because we want to remember what our blood vessels do. Arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart. That's the thing I want you to remember. Okay, so we go back to this picture here. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. Okay, that's what an artery does. It always carries blood away from the heart. Same thing is true of arterioles. Veins, oh, I realized that I didn't think this through all the way. Actually, no, we'll leave that there. We'll just put this underneath. You guys get it. Veins always carry blood towards the heart. So veins are always the blood vessels that it's traveling through so that blood can get back to the heart to get pumped around to where it needs to go. So arteries always travel away from the heart. They form smaller branches of arterioles. And then capillary beds, capillaries form beds to cover body tissues. So these are very, very, very tiny blood vessels here. God dang it. Form beds to cover body tissues. Some of that tissue was, like the little bronchioles, right, inside the inside our lungs, right? We look at bronchioles. The bronchioles are going to have these little alveoli at the end of them, and the alveoli are covered in a little capillary bed. And you can see they actually did draw that in like blue, and that's the deoxygenated stuff getting dropped off, and then the blood cells sort of becoming oxygenated, and then it becomes red, and so then it's going to travel, back to the heart through those veins there. So blood is veins are always traveling away from the heart. Arteries are always traveling towards the heart, and that's what you need to remember. You need to know the difference between those two, right? So arteries always away, veins always towards. So let's go ahead and track a red blood cell, right? Let's talk about a red blood cell and track the direction that's going to travel you know, as it sort of goes through like a life cycle here. So we go back to looking at like the chambers of our heart here, right? So a brand new red blood cell gets made by, let's say, your femur, right? It's never done its job before. So what it's, you know, right now it's deoxygenated. It's never picked up oxygen before. It's a brand new red blood cell. It doesn't have any oxygen in it. So it's going to have to travel to the heart to go get some oxygen. It goes to the heart so it can go to the lungs. So that brand new red blood cell travels into the right atrium before dropping into the right ventricle. The right ventricle will then pump it over to the lungs, where it will then travel back to the, and it picks up oxygen for the very first time, right? Now it travels back to the heart in the left atrium before dropping into the left ventricle, and then it gets pumped out to the body. And for the very first time, that red blood cell drops off its oxygen, right? And it picks up CO2 for the very first time. Then it travels back to the right atrium, to right ventricle, to the lungs, left atrium, left ventricle, body, right? And it's just going to kind of continue repeating that whole cycle, right? So that is how your blood vessels work. Your blood is going to go from heart to lungs to heart to body, to heart to lungs to heart to body, over and over and over and over and over again. So it travels through arteries whenever it's traveling away from the heart, and it travels through veins whenever it is traveling back towards the heart. Now, I did draw arteries and veins in these colors right here, red representing the arteries and blue representing the veins. And I did that because most of 90% of your arteries are carrying the oxygenated blood, because you have a large body and there's arteries traveling all over you to deliver blood. However, it should be noted that there is a situation where some of the arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood. That's your pulmonary arteries. Remember, arteries are always going away from the heart. That's our definition. Sometimes heart is going, blood is going away from the heart to the lungs because it's deoxygenated. So don't always assume that arteries are carrying oxygenated blood. That's not always true, but it is true in most cases. Throughout your entire body, it's true. At the lungs, though, it's flipped, right? So that is sort of the difference there. The really big ones, guys, you're probably not going to hear the term arterioles or venules that often, but they will ask you what a capillary is and what an artery is and what a vein is. Arteries go away from the heart, veins go towards the heart, capillaries are the exchange site. And capillaries are super, super microscopic. Their walls are really thin so that blood and oxygen can move from one side of the wall to the other. Not blood, but oxygen can move from one side of the wall to the other, right? Capillaries are absolutely tiny, 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 tiny. So that is all of your blood vessels, other than one very special type of arteries that we do have to talk about here really quick. So most of the time, your body tissue is going to be covered in these capillaries, right? So if we look at a capillary bed, capillary beds are going to cover tissues kind of like this. They form these little beds here, right? And those beds just cover tissue. Your heart, though, remember, your heart has to pump all the time. It has started beating since before you were born, and it has never stopped for even a second, hopefully, in your entire life, right? So that is a type of muscle that has an incredible amount of endurance, right? There's just a massive amount of endurance in your heart muscle, right? So if that's the case, we need to make sure that we are always delivering oxygen. So the very first place that blood is going to go is to the heart itself. Your heart will always keep itself alive before anything else. It's kind of like when you're on a plane, they say, like, you know, secure your mask first before assisting anybody else, right? If you need to, like, if the oxygen mask dropped from the ceiling or whatever, put your own mask on, then you can help someone else. The reason they say that is because you can't help anybody if you are not conscious. So your coronary arteries are on this little tiny loop that branch right off of the aorta. They are the very first branch, right? Ooh, that is such a small darn picture. There we go. So you can see, right, the chamber, there's the aorta. That's the biggest artery you've got. But there is immediately like a little branch that comes off from there and covers the heart. That is the heart supplying itself with blood. When you hear about somebody who has had a heart attack, they are usually describing one of these coronary arteries is blocked with like plaque or some other material. So 33% of deaths in the Western world, about a third of everybody who dies usually dies from some version of coronary artery disease, where these coronary arteries, these blood vessels here get blocked. And when that happens, if you get blockage, if you get cholesterol and plaque and things like that building up on the inside of your blood vessels, it causes blockages like this. You can see, right? Blood can't travel through there very effectively. So then what happens is like your blood cells start to clot. And then all of a sudden that tissue can no longer get oxygen delivery and it dies. You can see we're kind of like showing this is damaged heart muscle. The cells that live in this section of the heart didn't get any oxygen. Therefore, their mitochondria couldn't produce any energy. Therefore, the cell cannot keep itself alive. That's what we have all of that for, right? So the most important arteries in your body are absolutely your coronary arteries, because they are what allow you to keep the heart muscle alive, and the heart muscle is what pumps blood throughout the entire body. If you can't keep the heart alive, you can't keep anything alive, right? There's also stroke. Stroke is the same thing, but it happens in the brain. If you get plaque buildup in the arteries that travel up to the brain and you can't deliver oxygen there, that's also obviously very, very dangerous. So those are your coronary arteries there. There's the SA node. I forgot this PowerPoint. Goes in a weird order. So there's your coronary arteries, right? Right here. Where'd the picture go? Oh yeah, there it is. And then here is your conduction system. That's the SA node, creating the signal. There's the AV node, delaying the signal, and then it travels out through like the bundle of His and the Purkinje fibers to allow for all that contraction to take place. So all of this, but actually really quickly, anybody have any questions on any of that? Everybody understand which blood vessels are which?
Yep, thank you.
Cool. That's the big part. That's the test question kind of stuff. So next thing that we're going to see is talking about like heart actually like functioning, right? So if we're calculating how our heart actually works, we are going to have different sections of your nervous system that are controlling this, okay? So you've got two divisions in your, I'm not going to spend too much time on the nervous system today because we're getting into that later. But you've got two divisions of your nervous system. You've got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight system, okay? You don't have any control over it, and it's in charge of panicking, okay? Fighting or fleeing, right? It's in charge of amping you up. Parasympathetic is like, relax, rest, we're good, life is okay, we're safe, right? That is your parasympathetic system. Your parasympathetic system is the rest and digest system, okay? So as we're looking at it, right, your sympathetic system increases your heart rate and your parasympathetic system slows your heart rate. So when you start exercising and the oxygen consumption of the myocardium, the heart muscle itself at rest is higher than the resting of your skeletal muscle. Your skeletal muscle being all of the muscle throughout the rest of your body, right? So when you are resting, your heart's actually consuming more oxygen than anything else because you're not really using any of that other skeletal muscle. But as you start exercising and your muscle, you start recruiting more and more muscle fibers in your legs or your body, your chest or whatever, right? Doesn't matter what body part you're using. You start using that muscle tissue, all of a sudden you start needing to put out massive amounts of energy. And so what will happen is all of a sudden the heart will go, holy cow, like our blood's very acidic because there's lactic acid, in the bloodstream now. There is a lack of oxygen in all these red blood cells that are coming back. None of them have any oxygen left in them, right? So clearly we need to increase oxygen consumption, right? So what will happen is your heart will start beating faster. As your heart starts going, first off, I don't have enough oxygen, which means I want more oxygen, so then it will speed up. And then secondly, your body goes, oh, I guess that the muscle needs more oxygen as well. So what will happen is your body's heart will start beating faster. And that is how it's under the control of your nervous system. So there's a couple things at play here, right? The sinoatrial node is sensing when there is some lactic acid in the blood. When your blood's very acidic, that means you're exercising. When you are when you're using up all of your oxygen, when all the oxygen's not available to the heart muscle itself, the heart muscle goes, oh, holy crap, we're not getting very much oxygen, and then it starts speeding up. This is actually one of the reasons why we call it the Fick principle. And the Fick principle is basically that one of the reasons we look at resting heart rate as like an indicator of how good a shape somebody is in. If your resting heart rate's really, really high, that tells us that your cardiovascular system is not in as good a shape as it could be. If your resting heart rate's really low, it shows us that your heart rate's that you're usually in pretty good shape, right? The reason why we know that's true is because like a heart that has to beat more often is a heart that is struggling to deliver oxygen throughout the body, right? Like if your heart can squeeze really, really hard and it can inject a ton of blood throughout the body, all that oxygen can get delivered pretty easily in, let's say, 20 beats, right? But if it has to do it in 40 beats, which is twice as many, that means that it's ejecting half of the amount of blood per every beat. That's the Fick principle. So we understand this through a term called cardiac output, right? Now, normally the regulation of your heart rate, it's all by your SA node. It's about 70 beats per minute for most people. Now you might be thinking like, I know some of you guys probably know your resting heart rate. It's probably a little bit lower than that. If your resting heart rate is lower than 70 beats per minute, then that shows that you're probably in pretty good shape. If your heart rate's a little bit higher than that, then cardiovascularly, it might mean it's like, oh, well, let's go ahead and work on some heart rate, training and stuff, right? Typical heart rate's around 70 to 80 beats per minute. The increase in your heart rate is accomplished by your sympathetic nervous system kind of controlling and speeding up that heart rate. As we're looking at that, actually, I don't need, those terms never come up, so I'm actually going to skip the Frank Starling law. But all that's under the control of your nervous system. So as your brain sends a signal to the heart that says like, hey, speed up, the brain needs more oxygen, the heart needs more oxygen, the muscles need more oxygen, we got to speed up this heart rate, right? That controls everything. And then your heart starts beating faster. This is why, guys, you don't have any control over your heart rate at all, right? You have no control over your heart rate. It is completely autonomic. Now, I know some of you guys might be thinking, it's like, I meditate, I know how to control my heart rate. Yeah, you can control things that result in your heart rate slowing down, but you have no conscious control over your heart rate. Yeah. No conscious control. You can't say beat, right? Like it doesn't work that way. It's completely autonomic. It is controlled by the various chemicals of your body, okay? So when you exercise, you are continually contracting your heart. And what that does is that strengthens your heart muscle. Also, there's a really cool thing that your body does when you exercise regularly. This is a very weird concept that we don't fully understand, so it's kind of hard to explain. When you exercise regularly, you end up with needing a lot of oxygen, right? Like you just need lots of oxygen in order to be able to like supply the tissues with enough energy. So what will happen is if your cells experience like a lack of oxygen just consistently, what they do is they go, holy cow, we just never get oxygen. So what they do is they actually make more things that are good at delivering oxygen. Your body will make more red blood cells, it will make more hemoglobin, and it will put more mitochondria into all of your cells. That's why runners actually, you can increase your endurance through training. You increase your endurance because your body goes, I need to be better at outputting energy. So it makes the things that make energy. It makes more mitochondria within the cells. Your heart cells, by the way, have a ton of mitochondria, but the more cardio that you do, the more mitochondria you're going to make. And that's why exercise makes your heart healthier. It makes it better at outputting energy. So we definitely need to understand how to look at our overall like cardiac output here. So as we're looking at cardiac output, right? Cardiac output is the overall performance of your heart. Now, we can calculate this, right? It is made up of your heart rate, that's the number of beats in 1 minute's time, and your stroke volume, the volume of blood ejected by the heart per beat. So if we look here, right, at overall cardiac output, okay, there's a formula that we can use. Cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. That's our formula, okay? Cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So cardiac output is the overall performance of the heart. Oh my God, I can't type. So that's your cardiac output. That's the overall performance of the heart. Your heart rate is the number of beats per minute. And your stroke volume is the volume of blood ejected by the heart per beat. And that's what each of those things is. So let's use some math here, just some numbers, because it kind of highlights what I'm talking about. Let's say your heart is beating 100 times per minute, and it's ejecting, we'll say, 25 milliliters of blood. Right? So 25 milliliters of blood every time the heart beats and 100 beats per minute. That means that your cardiac output is 2,500 milliliters per minute. And that's our cardiac output, okay? Because 100 times 25. And that's how we calculate that. So now that gives us a reason. It's like, oh, okay, well, we're going to pay attention to this cardiac output, because what if somebody is ejecting, like, what if they need 2,500 milliliters of blood in order to like do a task, right? But their heart's only beating 50 beats per minute, right? But they still need 2,500 milliliters of blood. Well, that means that like their stroke volume needs to be 50 milliliters per beat. So 50 times, if their heart is actually functioning even stronger, if their heart is stronger and able to pump twice as much blood out, then it can get the job done in half as many beats. This is why we know that a lower resting heart rate is a really good indicator of health. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, Al and I are going to run a race. I've used this example before. Al and I are going to run a race, and we're both going to get on a treadmill, and we're both going to go the same speed. Okay. So it's a weird race, but we're both going to go 1 mile, and we're both going to go at 6.0 on the treadmill. Okay. And what we're actually measuring is what my heart rate is and what your heart rate is at the end of 1 mile. So we both go 1 mile at 6 miles per hour. And then at the end of it, let's say my heart rate is 145 beats per minute. And your heart rate is 125 beats per minute. So you were able to do 1 mile in 125 beats per minute. I was able to do 1 mile in 145 beats per minute. That tells us that you are in better shape than I am. Does that make sense? Right? You're in better shape because you're able to get the same amount of work with less effort. Now, obviously, we can't measure cardiac output directly. You know, like we would need some pretty darn specialized equipment to be able to measure our client's stroke volume, you know, in order to like, we would need to like see, it's like every time their heart beats, like how much blood comes flying out of there. Like that'd be very, very difficult for us to measure. But because we can measure the heart rate so easily, we know that these two have an inverse relationship, right? If the heart rate goes up, that means that the stroke volume is low. But if the heart rate's down low, that means that the stroke volume is really high. So you can see that here is why we pay attention to, you know, what our clients' resting heart rates are. You know, we want our clients' resting heart rate to go down over time because that shows us that their heart is being much, much, much more efficient. It's also one of the ways that you know that a client is overtraining. If their heart rate is just staying elevated and it never comes down, it means that they're not resting, their body is in panic mode. And so they're overly stressed and they're probably heading for some type of like overuse injury. Where's blood pressure at? Did we not put blood pressure up here? Are you kidding me? Okay, I thought that was in the slides, and apparently it's not. Hold on. Sorry, guys. There we go. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about blood pressure before I get into training your heart. We're about to wrap things up, but oh, where is the Vo2 Max? There it is. Good Lord. That's where we were. Okay, so really quickly, just talking about blood pressure, because I must have put this in here just because like I knew people were going to ask about it. It's not actually in the PowerPoint, so I don't think you have any homework questions related to blood pressure. But blood pressure is the pressure of the, it's the measurement of the pressure that's pushing on your blood vessels when your heart is either squeezing or when it is relaxing. So we split blood pressure into two different numbers. We have your systolic number and we have your diastolic number. So your systolic blood pressure is the pressure that's pushing during a heart's contraction. That contraction is what we call systole. Typically, we want that amount of pressure to be around 120 units of pressure. And then when your heart relaxes, we call that diastole, right? Typically, we want the amount of pressure to be about 80 units of pressure. So normal blood pressure is going to be 120 over 80. Hypertension, high blood pressure, as characterized like the disease, is 140 over 90. So a pretty small window there. I mean, we don't want a big difference. Now, for the record, your blood pressure is going to go crazy. If you were ever to take your, like, let's say you're doing like a deadlift or something, right? And I had a blood pressure cuffed on you, like you do like a really heavy deadlift, right? Your blood pressure would probably be like 300, you know, like, it spikes like crazy. That's actually fine. Your blood we can deal with really high pressures of blood. But the thing is, we only want it in those moments. That's what allows us, you know, by creating all that high pressure, it's what allows maximal blood to go to where it needs to go.
Is that considered like your adrenaline, like adrenaline rush? Like
yeah, kind of. Yeah, adrenaline increases your blood pressure as well. Yeah, absolutely. It's when it's resting And it's
Oh,
if it's like if you're at rest doing nothing and your blood pressure is already 140/90, that tells us like, oh, that's not such a good sign. That tells us that something's increasing the pressure of your blood. Either your arteries are stiff, your autonomic nervous system is stressed out, or maybe you've taken caffeine. Caffeine can actually increase your blood pressure. Or maybe there's some plaque in the blood vessels that's raising that pressure. So those are kind of the examples that we're seeing here, right? Ideally, we want it to be over 120/80 when we are at rest. It can totally be higher than when you're exercising. I think the highest ever recorded blood pressure was something like 500, which is wild. But like, you know, that's during exercise. We need that pressure to get blood to where it needs to go. So let's talk about training the heart. Well, like I said a minute ago, as you continue doing cardiovascular exercise, your heart is going to increase its efficiency. Your body's going to go, holy crap, we sure do beat this heart thing a whole bunch. We need to get good at beating the heart. You know, like your body goes, man, we need to make the heart stronger. So what it will do is it will develop more type 1 muscle fibers. So there is sort of a difference between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. Type 2 muscle fibers are usually much bigger muscle fibers that can contract really hard, but they don't have any endurance. Type 1 muscle fibers are muscle fibers that have a whole bunch of mitochondria. If you look at like mitochondrial density, picture of this here. I wish I could find a good photo of like just a diagram of this without having to actually make one. Yeah, I guess this kind of works. So here's sort of the difference between type 1 and type 2. You'll see the dark fibers, the dark red fibers are type 1 fibers, meaning that that's sort of indicating that they get a lot of blood flow. Whereas like these fibers here, these type 2 fibers, the white fibers, those are getting like less blood flow. And so you can see like this has very little red fibers and has a whole bunch of white fibers. This is a type 2 muscle fiber. This is a type 1 muscle fiber. Your heart would basically be nothing but red fibers. Like we're going to say here that your heart is mostly made of type 1 muscle fibers. I would argue that if you have like type 1 means you have lots of endurance, type 2 means you have little endurance. I would argue that the heart is like type 1/2. That's not a real thing. There is no type 1/2, but like that's how much endurance these have. These muscle fibers contain a ton of mitochondria and a ton of enzymes that allow energy production to take place. So they're very reliant on oxygen, which is why your heart has to supply itself with blood, because it needs massive amounts of oxygen. Now, when you're exercising, when you're doing particularly extended durations of exercise, your body creates more enzymes in the process to make you better at exercising for long durations. It creates more mitochondria to make you better at spitting out energy. And it even makes more blood vessels to make sure that you're getting even more delivery of oxygen. This is something that you'll see. So like if you looked at a type 1 bodybuilder, like let's say you looked at like somebody who's just huge, they got massive, massive, massive muscles, right? They're much more of a type 2 situation, right? They have very large muscle fibers. So their muscle fibers probably don't have very many capillaries running through them. Instead, they just have really large amounts of protein in their muscles. Whereas a type 1 athlete would have a ton of blood vessels running through very small muscles. You know, their muscles are going to be, you know, that's the difference between like a bodybuilder versus like a runner. Versus runner. You know, you look at the difference here, right? Very, very different, right? Long and lean muscle fibers versus large, bulky muscle fibers. This is a type 2 athlete. This is a type 1 athlete. And they're very different looking from one another. You can see there, right? There's the difference between like a sprinter who's type 2 and a runner who's type 1. We're gonna get more into this tomorrow, but think of your heart as type 1. The muscle fibers, you don't want your heart getting any larger. It doesn't get bigger when it gets stronger. It stays the same size, but it does create more mitochondria, it does create more blood vessels, and it does create more oxidative enzymes to increase your ability to consume oxygen. That is why we are going to look at what is called your Vo2 max as the best indicator of cardiovascular health. So your Vo2 max, that stands for volume of O2, volume of oxygen consumed at maximum. Now, when I say consumed, what I mean is oxygen goes in, becomes energy, and CO2 comes out. So the Vo2 max is somebody who is consuming lots of oxygen. Now, if you have a lot of muscle mass and you have a lot of mitochondria and you have a lot of materials that just consume oxygen efficiently, your Vo2 max is going to be really high. So Al and I, in our race earlier, right, Al was able to get the job done with less beats than I was, right? I was like huffing and puffing and he was fine, right? So that tells us that Al has a higher volume of oxygen that he's able to consume than me. I was only able to consume much. Oxygen goes in, some of it didn't get used, and it comes out because my red blood cells can only carry so much. My mitochondria can only eat so much, right? So what ends up happening is I can't consume very much oxygen, which means my body has to do more heartbeats in order to like try to keep up with the amount of work that I'm doing. So we want to have a very high Vo2 max. We want to have a very high consumption of oxygen. As intensity climbs, the volume of oxygen consumed will also climb. We want us to be able to consume as much oxygen as possible. This is where one of the things that we're going to look at is the Vo2 max. The maximum amount of oxygen you can consume tells us how good a shape you're in. This is where we look at like actually taking somebody and putting them on a Vo2 machine. So if you look at a Vo2 test, you'll see,
hi, my name is,
she's going to have this person get on a treadmill and they're going to sprint until eventually they are consuming all of the oxygen that they're bringing in. So you'll notice there's two separate tubes here. You look at this here, you can see these two individual tubes, right? She's got one, well, actually, and she's got two tubes going into the mouth. One is pumping in oxygen. The other one is actually measuring how much CO2 is coming out. So there's going to be a ratio of how much she's consuming. So let's say I bring in 500 units of oxygen and I spit out 350 units of CO2. Okay. So what that means is that I consumed 70% of that oxygen, 70% of that oxygen became CO2, 70% of it, right? The remaining 30% is still oxygen, you know? But as I continue doing more and more work, what will happen is I will consume more and more oxygen until eventually, let's say 500 units of oxygen come in, 500 units of CO2 come out. That's 100% oxygen consumed. What that means is that like I need more oxygen delivery. You know, unfortunately, I don't have the tools necessary to do it. So when we're measuring a Vo2, when we're using a Vo2 machine, right, we are looking at the ratio of oxygen to carbon dioxide. So if 10 units come in and 3 units come out, oxygen, right? So let's go ahead and look at that, right? Let's say we've got like, you know, we'll draw two little tubes here. So let's say this is like 70% oxygen and you know, that would be this version here. Oh, that is so very frustrating. All right, we'll put it there. 70% oxygen. This is 100. That's about 70, right? So this down here, this 70%. Oh, I need to cover there. Hold on. Drawing charts is so hard. I can never rely on the friggin' internet. So that is the oxygen consumption versus, that is the oxygen consumption versus that. So this is CO2, right? Oh, actually, that's what I need to do. Sorry, that's what it looks like. So here's the thing. This is oxygen right here, okay? This is CO2 right here. This is CO2. This is where there was some oxygen left over, right? We had some oxygen left. A lot of it got burnt up as CO2, but there was some oxygen left. Over here, all of it got burned up as CO2, right? That's the difference between 70% and 100%. For the record, when you are doing work, when you are living, guys, you are always consuming at least 70% of the oxygen that you bring in. So let's say you bring in, you take a big deep breath, right? Air goes in, 70% of that air is going to get burned up to keep your body alive. That remaining 30% though, it just stays and you go, you exhale it. So we do exhale some oxygen. But as we continue exercising, as our intensity goes up, then we can start consuming 75% of the oxygen that we bring in, 80% of the oxygen that we bring in, 90% of the oxygen we bring in, until eventually we're working as absolutely hard as we can, and we are consuming 100% of the oxygen coming in. So if I'm consuming 100% of the oxygen coming in, then what's happening is I don't have enough. That tells me I don't have enough oxygen to convert the rest of that to energy. We have now hit my VO2 max. So let's say like Eric and I are both consuming oxygen at 100% of our VO2 max, and he's bringing in 500 units of oxygen, and I'm only bringing in 400 units of oxygen. We're both working at 100% of our number, but he is consuming 100 units more than me. That means that he is in much better shape than I am, because he is able to consume more of it. So that's what we use a VO2 max machine for. If you actually look at a VO2 test, what they'll do is they'll get you up to a full sprint, working as hard as you can until you literally have to tap out. And when you tap out, that tells us, you know, where your VO2 max is. They're measuring how much oxygen is going in versus how much energy is going out.
I remember when I had to do that.
Oh,
training,
did you?
Yeah, for kickboxing.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it's a super fun test.
It was
really important.
It was not fun. I'll just say
no,
that.
No, it's not fun to do.
It was not fun at all.
I mean, it literally is. You're wearing like a mask.
Yeah.
Which is already uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And like you have to get to a full 100% effort.
Oh, yep.
Yeah. So let's see here. So if you ever do like a VO2 max test, that's exactly what I want. That image is so freaking pixelated. Hold on. There we go. So you take a look at this person right here, right? They got them on the treadmill and they got their heart rate up to about 190. This person's probably about 20 years old, I would assume. Where's their age? 27. So they got their heart rate up to about 190, which is really freaking high. And that's when they hit their VO2 max. That's where they had to tap out, right? So then what that tells us is that their VO2 max is somewhere between 36 and 42 milliliters of oxygen per, and then they weigh 124 kilograms, so per kilogram. So they're 257 pounds, right? But their fitness level's pretty good. at 257 pounds, you know, they still have a fair VO2 max. It could improve, you know, we want to get their VO2 max a little bit higher. The more oxygen you can consume, the better shape you are in, because that means that you are able to take in oxygen and spit out even more energy. So that's what the respiratory exchange ratio is, okay? It's the ratio of oxygen consumed versus the amount of oxygen present in the body. Or you can think of it as the ratio of oxygen consumed versus the ratio of CO2 exhaled. If you exhale 100% of what you brought in as CO2, that tells us you're working as absolutely hard as possible. So in the body, 70% of the oxygen is consumed by the cells, and that remaining 30% is what's left over. That's when you are perfectly at rest. So when you guys are sleeping at your absolute lowest intensity, you are burning 70% of your energy, or 70% of the oxygen that you're bringing in. The remaining 30% just kind of gets exhaled. You know, you don't need that remaining 30%. And when you are full sprinting, working as absolutely hard as you can, feel like you're going to throw up, that is when you are consuming 100% of the oxygen. Any oxygen that goes in gets burnt up. All of it is CO2 on the way out. That's the respiratory exchange ratio. Now, what's kind of fun about this, what's fun about the respiratory exchange ratio, guys, is that when you are at 70%, you are burning fat for fuel. And when you're at 100%, you are burning carbs for fuel. So we can actually figure out where your energy is coming from, which we will tie to nutrition in a couple weeks. So as the efficiency of the heart. So if we're looking at this, summarizing everything we talked about today, an individual with a resting heart rate that is 10 beats lower than it was before they were training tells us that they have increased the efficiency of their heart. And if their VO2 is higher, if they are consuming more oxygen, right? Let's say you were consuming, when you're at rest, 100 units of oxygen, and now you're consuming 150. What that tells us is that you have a body that has more muscle mass, more mitochondria, more blood vessels, more hemoglobin, more blood cells, right? You've got all kinds of material that increased your oxygen consumption. You have more stuff that takes more oxygen to run in your body now. That is a really good sign. That tells us that you are getting more athletic, right? So the increased mitochondrial content increases your oxygen consumptions. Now, there are some things that are going to limit your VO2 max, and it's going to get into this at the end, but honestly, it's all the math stuff. And this is stuff that you're never going to be tested on. So it's in the PowerPoint slides here, and I'll mention it, but don't worry too much about this. But basically, the way we understand VO2 max is looking at like your arterial oxygen consumption versus your, we call it your hemo concentration. It's the volume of like blood and how much oxygen your blood cells are actually able to kind of grab. These are the averages. So these are the averages that we're going to see in a sedentary person versus a trained person. You can see all the numbers are much higher, right? A trained individual is able to consume much more oxygen. So don't worry about any of those numbers because they never ever come up. That is literally, and like even if you were working in a lab setting, the computer would do all those calculations for you. But they wanted to like show you the why behind, you know, why we know all of this is true. And that's it. We got real technical there at the end. But basically think of it this way, guys. You want to consume as much oxygen as possible. The more you can consume, the better in shape you're in. You know, that's what it tells us.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, please. What's up?
Okay. So like one of my buddies that I sometimes go to the gym with, I haven't been to the gym with them in a minute, but every time we would go to the gym, I would catch him yawning and yawning and yawning. I'd be like, "Are you tired, bro?" And he's just like, "No, I'm not tired. I don't know what it is. I don't know why I keep yawning." And I kind of looked it up, and what I read a little bit was he like lack of oxygen, I guess, or he's getting, or he doesn't have that much or something like that. Because every time I turned around, bro, he was like yawning and shit. I'm like, are you tired, bro? We could leave right now if you're not up to it. You know what I mean?
So here's the thing. So when you exercise, you will produce, stress hormones, right? Which are fight or flight hormones that activate your sympathetic system. And then in between, like when you are resting, your body will often make anti-work hormones, right? It will make serotonin and dopamine and things like that, things that will cause you to relax, So basically his body, it's because he's yawning between sets probably. And so
yeah, he was.
Is like his body is going, all right, well, now that we're done with that stress, let's go sleep. And so it's making like serotonin, and serotonin is just a hormone that triggers yawning. Best thing you can do to sort of avoid that is to get him to warm up a little bit better. And then put your highest intensity work at the beginning of your workout. And that will sort of like amp him in and get him to a level there. And then always cool down at the end of your workout. And that way his body will get into the rhythm of being used to like working and resting and keeping those things separate.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Because I was like, man, it seems like he doesn't want to work out or some shit. I'm over here like busting and getting down and hitting weights, and I turn around and he's like yawning, standing in the corner, like leaning on one of the the workout exercise things and stuff.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's basically his body like trying to go into sleep mode because it thinks that it's done.
Oh, okay.
That was a good question. Any other questions, guys? That was a fun one. I've never had that question before. Oh, all right.
Nope.